Did you know that an owl is bad luck, or that pointing to your friend's arm whilst describing how your brother broke his arm as a child would invite either one of you to break your arm in the exact same way? Although we now think of the Roman Empire as one of the peak examples of civilization, law and order, and advanced sophistication, that is not necessarily an accurate representation. With the empire stretching across centuries and continents, it's impossible to say that everyone, everywhere, was a perfect Roman citizen who was committed to the highest ideals. In fact, as in many cultures around the world, the Roman Empire was home to a disparate group of peoples and cultures all mashed together into one big cauldron, each with their own beliefs, concerns, and superstitions. So let's take a look at some of the weirdest Roman superstitions. Welcome to the Roman Empire. When we think about Rome, we often imagine the Christian version of the city, replete with temples, modern conveniences, and more. But throughout the empire's history, the idea that the people and belief system were all one nicely agreed upon ideal couldn't be further from the truth. Ancient Rome was a melting pot of beliefs and superstitions, as the original empire was mainly a polytheistic civilization where households would recognize and pray to multiple gods and goddesses. Nature ruled everything, and the balance of the elements was crucial. In a world before science and technology, Romans dealt with unexplained phenomena every day, lived in darkness, and were afraid of simple things. Superstitions were an important way to understand how the world worked and to avoid bringing any of those bad events to your family. For the Romans, a superstition was a way to avert bad luck or to appease a god that may take your actions badly. One of the areas that Romans were particularly wary about was death. Their firm belief in the afterlife and fear of awakening restless spirits meant that they had strict funerary rites designed to avert misfortune. Doorways were scary. There were a number of superstitions relating to thresholds and doorsteps. Romans believed that objects and living beings alike had some sort of soul. For Romans, anything from trees to stones, animals to furniture would all house a being's spirit called noumena. Stones were one of the prime candidates for spirits, especially if the stone lay at the boundary between one home and another. We can see the importance of this by looking at the vocabulary used to talk about it. Boundaries are called terminus in Latin, reflecting the Roman god who watched over the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. One Roman superstition about boundaries was that you always had to cross the threshold of a house by using your left foot. According to Roman superstition, stumbling at the doorway denoted bad luck. Even Pythagoras believed this to be true. He's reported to have said that if you trip at the threshold as you leave, you should turn back again. This belief has a modern reflection in the custom of carrying a bride over the threshold. If she's carried, she can't trip and begin the marriage with bad luck. The city of Rome was filled with grand villas with elaborate doorways. Most Romans believed that their home was guarded by a spirit known as lares or other domestic spirits called penates, which would protect their family from harm. These spirits were found in many doorways, commonly depicted as a young man holding a drinking cup. There would often be a small shrine to the lares at the heart of the home to honor the spirit who kept the family safe. As you left the house and came back home, it was customary to lay your hand on the doorpost and offer up a brief prayer in recognition of the lair's hard work. They say when you marry in May. Romans were influenced by religious symbolism and observances, and that extended all the way to betrothals and marriages. According to Roman belief, May was not the beautiful month of early spring, but carried an undertone of the underworld. In the Roman calendar, May was dedicated to the festival of Lemuria, which was when the uneasy spirits of the dearly departed were known to come back and haunt their living relatives. Lemuria meant engaging in rituals and practices to appease these restless spirits, trying to head them off before they caused harm to their living relatives. As the focus was on appeasing the dead, May was seen as an inauspicious start to a marriage. The dead could interrupt in more ways than just causing marital strife, however. During May and the festival of Lemuria, when the veil between the worlds of the dead and the living was at its thinnest, it was taboo to use anyone's name when talking about the dead. The superstition was that if you said the name of one of the deceased, it would attract their attention and draw their restless spirit to you, particularly if they'd met an untimely end. Throwing beans. With Lemuria putting a spanner in the works for May weddings, you might think that was enough of a superstition surrounding this festival season. But no, the Romans also had a ritual of throwing beans over their shoulders to appease restless spirits. In Roman belief, beans held a peculiar rank. Romans believed that beans represented departed souls, and by throwing them over your shoulder, you were symbolically feeding the wandering spirits that surrounded households during Lemuria. Accordingly, a ritual sprang up where the head of the household would walk through their home at the dead of the night, throwing black beans over his shoulder and chanting, "I send these, with these beans I redeem me and mine." By doing this, he'd distract the malevolent spirits into collecting the beans and leaving his home in peace. Bird-brained. Ancient Romans were well connected to the natural world and had firm belief that everything contained a spirit of some kind. If you were trained well, you could read the signs that the gods left and interpret the messages they wanted to communicate. Birds were particularly important in this practice, also known as augury. The type of bird, its behavior, and even the way it flew could illustrate the god's will to the keen-eyed observer. If the bird flew to the right, that was generally accepted to mean a favourable outcome, whilst a left-leaning flight would mean the opposite. A sinister outcome was on the cards. Most of us will have seen some sort of depiction of a wild-haired augur crouching over a dying chicken, using its death throes to predict the outcome of a battle or another important event. It was common practice for augurs to give their interpretation of events, and their words were important enough that even an emperor would listen to them. Augurs didn't just slaughter domestic birds though, they also read the signs of wild creatures. Eagles and vultures were both held to be heralds of good fortune thanks to their majestic stature, whilst crows and owls were seen to be harbingers of ill fortune. Owls are often viewed with some level of suspicion even in the modern world. Their silent approach and haunting call in the stillness of the night means that this nocturnal bird occupies a curious space in our imaginations and folklore. Romans certainly believed the worst about owls, seeing them as beings with the ability to access hidden knowledge and uncover secrets. The Romans were especially concerned about owls and believed that if you heard an owl hoot, you would experience a death or disaster. If one of these birds was seen in a Roman city, it wasn't just left alone. The Roman citizens would capture it and perform a purification ritual over the owl to avert the impending doom. It's just the done thing. One of the things that's important to remember is that not everyone would have believed exactly the same thing, and that's especially true for superstitions. Even the most rational person these days might think twice about walking under a ladder, breaking a mirror, or opening an umbrella indoors. Here are some of the traditions that Romans would have done without thinking just because it was the traditional rite to avoid bad luck. Salve. Sneezing has been the bane of many during the summer months when the pollen count is high and hay fever rules all. But for the Romans, a sneeze was far more meaningful than a mere bodily function to clear the passageways. It could be a sign from the gods. As always with Romans though, the meaning was far from clear. Sneezes could mean good or bad luck depending on the interpretation. If you sneezed to the right, it was normally taken as a sign of approval from the gods. In contrast, sneezing to the left was often taken as a warning sign of bad things to come. To avert any potential misfortune coming from a sinister sneeze, those nearby would generally call out a blessing to negate the possible bad luck. In the Roman Empire, this would normally be Salve, which translates to good health. Going on a trip, time for a nice sit down. Travelling in the ancient world was a hazardous undertaking and one that quite often claimed people's lives. With bandits, bad weather, and unsafe roads, setting out on a long journey was a dangerous thing to do. The Roman Empire was also massive, and making the trip from one province to another could take weeks. One superstition that came about was the need to sit down before you embarked on a journey of any length. It probably comes from the ritual of sitting to offer a prayer to the spirits who could protect you whilst you were on the road, but soon became something that you had to do to make sure that you arrived safely at your destination. Whistling, not in my house. Whistling on stage and on the deck of a ship are well known to bring bad luck, but the Romans took this one step further. It was completely taboo to whistle inside someone's home, as it was believed that this would invite unwanted spirits and bad energy into the home. This is connected to the Roman belief that the home is a sanctuary that needs to be protected at all costs. We don't know exactly where this superstition came from, but it's possible that whistling sounds like the calls associated with negative omens and restless spirits. When is a century not a century? When it's a Roman army. Romans were a suspicious lot and looked for patterns everywhere, from augury to numerology. The superstition surrounding the even 100 was entrenched throughout their whole society, including the military. Roman generals would adjust the number of men in a legion to make sure that their troops didn't total an even 100. Phallus charms everywhere. Hanging a bronze charm of a penis in your doorway would probably be frowned upon these days, but it was a common sight throughout the Roman Empire. Phalluses were seen as a symbol of fertility and vitality, and as such were great symbols to ward off the evil eye. Romans were a weird bunch with many weird beliefs, but when you take into account that they lived in a world before modern science had explained a lot of natural phenomena, it's easy to see how these superstitions cropped up. When you're trying to understand why bad things are happening to you, it's easy to turn to an unrelated event to find blame. So I hope you've learned a thing or two in this video. Remember that your left hand is evil, never point to someone when describing an injury, and take care at the doorway. There just might be a restless spirit waiting to enter in. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Roman Empire. Please do subscribe if you enjoyed it, as we do release a new video every Friday. So until next week, have a great time. Cheers everyone.